Okay, so the Agar Kim is the name of this temple, and we have 3 temples there, which they point out, right? A very primitive temple, and then these a northern temple, a southern temple, right? The southern temple, which you can see was greatly expanded over a period of time. And just to point out, right, these are not close together like they are on the map. In fact, one of them is about quarter mile to a half mile down the hillside from the other temple that's looking up over the bluff. The surrounding temenos, or sacred area, looks out over the Mediterranean from one of the highest vantage points on the island. And just to point out, the highest elevation in Malta is a little under 1,000 feet sea level. I think it's 865 feet, if I'm remembering correctly. So here you see a model, right, of the later temple and some of its expanded phases. And here we have the temple itself. One thing that you can denote from this, right, is that only in the past 10 years that these structures have been placed above it. These tent-like roofs to keep off, particularly the rain. Malta's a rather dry place, but again, this has been one of the problems, that these stones have been cracking and flaking over the years since they've been exposed. And of course, as any archaeologist can tell you, right, once we dig up things, then it becomes a more complicated issue of how to preserve those things for people to see and to be able to visit without destroying them. So here, right, we have some of the interior rooms. And just to point out, the reconstruction that's been done on these temples has actually been rather minimal. Basically, they've been excavated, and there have been some, stones placed back up. Some of the decorated stones have been taken out. Copies have been put in, and the stones displayed in the museums. However, the real gem, right, is to be in the physical spaces where these are, and to get that kind of connection with this. With this ancient culture. So also found at Agar Kim, right, are 3 of these famous Rubenesque figures from the island. Now, of course, we see these and we think about, like that earlier ceramic figurine that I had shown you. These, look very much like the well-known earth goddess figures from elsewhere in Europe. But one of the things that we have to caution ourselves with, right, as opposed to that figure that I showed you earlier, that clearly had breasts and was designed to be representative of a female figure, there is a complete lack of sexual characteristics on these statues, and so a lack of gender. And so again, they may not be just maybe gods, right, perhaps, or ruling figures or something, people who had enough resources to not be a skinny little Maltese person in the Stone Age, I suppose. But nonetheless, we have that, and also you can notice from the one on the bottom right is that, right, we don't have heads on them. Now, just to talk about these, some of these figures are very small, something that you could carry in the palm of your hand, but some of them are enormous. And some of these that were found at Agar Kim, where they're about 5 feet tall, and of course, like many another ancient statue, right, they have removable heads, or had heads that could be put in, again, for reasons we can only hope to speculate on. But as a result of this, right, we have to understand these perhaps in a slightly different way, and just so can't clearly consider them to be similar to, right, again, these earth goddess figures. And in fact, again, may represent kings of the ruling family. So Tarshian Temple is also on the island of Malta. It's very, very close to the city of Valletta, for that matter. It, again, is something that has a relatively long period of use, going over 4 centuries. Again, very, very similar in terms of its construction, with these apseal rooms, right, walls built, and then build up around them. Another thing to point out about these is that it's assumed that there were roofs above them, probably through a use of layered stone, and then probably wooden roofs. just because, again, of what's been there. Of course, the other problem when we're dealing with ancient stone structures on an island that needs stone to build with, over the millennia, of course, things are hauled off and reused. And this is the case with the excavation of some of the earliest temples, Tarshian being done as well, is that they would dig out the soil and then just get rid of it rather than go through and process the soil to see what they could find in there. This was, some of them were excavated in the late 1800s, others in the early 20th century, which again was a bit of an odd time for Malta and for the Western European world. Here from Tarshian Temple, right on the left, you see a large ceremonial bowl, a handmade bowl, and on the right, one of these libation halls. So I'll just let that sink in. But again, you can, imagine the use of these as this, and again, also this idea of reconnecting, right, with the earth as a divinity, and particularly in a stone temple that's been excavated out of the earth, by returning the products of mankind to earth. And so in some ways, we see a very sort of Mediterranean kind of religion going on here, perhaps in a very, very early stone, or in a very, very early form. This is two views, right, of Tarshian Temple, with an altar with worked stone. Of course, my photograph on the left is later, after the installation of the roof, I think in 2009. And the first time I had visited the island of Malta, these roofs hadn't been put in there. So it's nice to see the money and dedication being, put into the preservation of them. Now, after the Malta had become part of the European Union, I suppose there were some more funds available to them for this. And here's another piece of stone from Tarshian, right? This temple, right? This relief of boar and goats. And again, this is, aside from these, these human figures, right? We get these zoomorphic shapes, and again, perhaps greatly denoting, issues of sacrifice, but also issues of our, an society based on agricultural and animal husbandry. Okay, well, I'll stop talking about the temples at the moment. There are many more of them, but you've in some ways seen the most impressive ones, but we don't want to show you everything. Leave something to the imagination, as it were. But now I'll talk about what is, rightly the most sort of famous and enigmatic building of Malta, is the Al-Sifliani Hypogeum. Now, this is a completely underground structure, right? A 3-level underground structure that had been, discovered, of course, by accident when they were redoing a building that was built on top of it. And this is, of course, an early photograph taken before 1920, even. And there's one of the earliest, modelings of a sort of a series of connected rooms connected by stairs and passageways. Just to point out, I actually have not been in there. And so just this past summer, when I led a tour to Sicily and Malta, I had a few people come on late, and they only let 80 people in a day. And so you buy your tickets months ahead in advance, and I couldn't get extra tickets. So I had to take one for the team, and I had one of my participants had a rather bad leg, so it's fine for her not to go crawling around underground as she was on a cane. So at any rate, we took it while the others went underneath, so you don't get to see my any photographs from it. However, you get to see them of others. And so what it was, we call it a hypogeum, right? Kind of prophetic room, right? Or place. But one thing that it was an underground necropolis. But all beyond that, not just a necropolis, but it was a cult center as well. When it was first excavated in the early 20th century, the remains of more than 7,000 humans were found. So there was really, along with pottery and other grave goods, and so there was a really thick layer of this. And because of the moisture that had gotten down in there, a lot of these skeletons just really crumbled to dust when they started moving them out of there. And again, it was not done in a proper modern way without, an absolute knowledge of how to deal with a site like this. So here we have the main chamber. which one descends down into from really a level underground. So we're about 2 levels underground, and then finally down the lowest bit of it is known as the Holy of Holies. On the right is one of the most famous sculptures coming out of Malta, known as the Sleeping Lady of the Hypogeum. She wasn't found in the Holy of Holies, but found in the main chamber. And this is a sculpture that's, probably more or less the same size as it appears on your computer screen. It's about, the bed is about 5 inches long. Here we're clearly dealing with a female figure, or we assume with a female figure. Of course, it could just be again, another Rubenesque, figure. But so of course, are we dealing with the goddess? Are we dealing with something that represents the deceased? Are we dealing with some kind of priestess and prophetess akin to the Delphic oracle? And of course, the influence of classical studies on the first archaeologists, gave an interpretation to that. So that's the term hypogeum. It's kind of stuck with it. Certainly, right, it was, again, an important place for an island that was not overwhelmingly wealthy in its grave goods, right? The great number of them that we have in Malta, or excuse me, in this hypogeum, even, which, perhaps not the gold that we're getting out of Mycenae and other great cultures, but nonetheless, still, and some of the greatest products that our small little island culture was able to produce. And so certainly because of all, over the centuries, right, bearing 7,000 people here, presumably that's only a portion of the people who had lived and died on the island over the course of that time. But, again, we can perhaps extrapolate from this that this is where important people, right, found their final resting places. Now, just to kind of get through the rest of Maltese history in about 4 or 5 more slides, is that this Neolithic culture kind of came to its natural end. There was a stop of construction on the Grand Temple complexes in the 3rd century BCE. However, the Tarshian site was still used as a cemetery. And that's, perhaps what happened with some of the other structures as well, if they were still, exposed by this point. Now, the first millennium in its earliest centuries would see the arrival of Phoenicians. And again, the way that the water currents and weather patterns work for those, that course going underneath the island of Sicily and coming to Malta and then heading up northward to get to the western end of it. That was under the Phoenician cultural sphere. Malta is part of that itinerary. We have trade with Greeks as well, by some of the grave goods that we have on the island, though it's not an overwhelming amount. And you've seen bigger and better, pottery elsewhere, so I won't bother to show you any of that. But it's really the arrival of the Romans after the conquest of Sicily and the incorporation of the island into the Roman Republic that, again, as I was saying, changes Malta. It goes from being, or having been, a rather unique place to just being a rather small place that was a small part of much larger cultures. What we do have, of course, we have grave goods from the Phoenicians. We don't have many Phoenician structures because it's presumed that they were incorporated by later Roman peoples, reused. Some, under some of the churches even, we do have remains of, Roman foundations and earlier foundations to show a kind of continuity of cult. But what we do have is what is known as the Domus Romana, though now I've changed it to Domus Romani because a colleague of mine with some other people from elsewhere and in Malta are in the process of excavating another Domus Romana. We can't quite call these villas, perhaps, or we haven't used that term yet, but we do have Roman houses. And so here what you have, of course, is a peristyle room with its mosaics. It's now on the inside of, been incorporated into a museum. And this is between the towns of Mdina and Rabat. And Mdina is literally, sorry, I didn't bother to write it on there, but Mdina, so Medina, but it's been pronounced in a more North African way. And of course, the names of Mdina and Rabat both denote the Arab presence on the island. And one thing that happens, the Domus Romana is from the 1st century BCE in its earliest phases. Oh God, sorry, I didn't put in an image there. I'm really sorry about that. Try to get them out of order. No, I left out an image. I'm terribly sorry. It was of a small limestone sarcophagus and a few tombstones with Arabic written on them that were from the 11th century when Malta was part of the Fatima ruling family. And so Malta, was a small part of larger empires from the time that Rome came. And so, of course, with the breakdown of the Roman Empire, we have other powers taking over the island. Most prominently, once we get into about the 7th century, right, it'll be the Arabs. Finally, the Normans will come and help drive them out as they did in Sicily, right? And, many other outside powers will take control of the island. At various points, it become part of the Spanish Empire, but when it was owning southern Italy and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, it became part of the French owned it until after the early 1800s when the British came in and the British took control of it, with the French somehow, so much as really even firing a shot at them, the same way that the Knights of St. John had sort of capitulated. But that's, when Malta kind of, its other high time comes in the 16th century. In 1530, the Knights of St. John, who were, as you may or may not know, an order of Knight Hospitallers from Jerusalem. They had been driven out of the Holy Land and had inhabited the island of Rhodes. As the Turkish powers were expanding, they were sapping Rhodes and started digging underneath it. They were besieging Rhodes, and sapping their fortress, digging underneath it. So the Knights were forced to capitulate, and basically they let them leave. The Spanish crown gave them control of the island, and so their occupation of the island, became kind of this, next great phase of unique history in Malta. 35 years later, right. The Knights' occupation of the island became one of the stopping points of Turkish expansion. And we have the Great Siege of Malta of 1565. Here's a somewhat contemporary painting of it, but what you see is the harbor of Valletta. And this was one of the great, and you can see it's a two-sided harbor. And this is why the island of Malta was such a phenomenal place for the Knights of St. John. It has these wonderful natural harbors. You can see indicated on this painting on the right side of the harbor from the tip of the peninsula, there's a chain stretched across it. As well, some of the churches nearby had great vantage points out looking out over the Mediterranean, and there was a church on the, you can see that peninsula on the right side, the third peninsula sticking out, which has obviously some fortifications on it. There's a Jesuit church there, and they had a bell, and they would look out and ring the bell, and when they rang the bell, it meant that the area outside of Malta was clear of Turkish ships. And so, depending on your point of view, then the Knights of St. John would go out there to defend Christendom, or they would act as pirates, sacking the ships of Saracens who were trading in North Africa. So again, typical story of one man's freedom fighter, right, is a terrorist from another society. But at any rate, in 1565, the Turks show up to take the island, and And of course, had they been able to take Malta and its wonderful harbors, it would have been a great place for them to start a conquest of the Italian peninsula and have a foothold into southern Europe. The island is so rocky that when they had sort of put themselves up into the very tip of the peninsula of Valletta, has the great fortress, and basically they took the entire population and kept them in there. There was one other walled city that they kept inhabited, where basically they left women and children, and they had them parade around on the walls of the island wearing helmets and carrying spears. And so when the Turks at one point went to go, because their real point of their invasion was to take the harbor, and once they had the harbor, they would have control of the island. They made a quick sortie against, this was the walled city of Rabat. They made a quick sortie to Rabat, but when they saw that it was still occupied by a defending force, they gave up the idea of besieging it. So it was one of these clever little ploys that really worked out. Eventually, the knights drove off the Turks, were able to send them out of there. And as I said, this is one of these great stopping points of Turkish expansion during the 16th century. Now, what happens as a result of that is that the city of Valletta becomes a fortress. I'll just click back. You can see on this map, right, that, we have troops there, but really it's only the tip of the island that was a fortress. But as a result, the entire peninsula and the entire city of Valletta becomes a fortress city. And as well, the surrounding communities start to become built up with fortresses and walls, so that this would never happen again. So one of the highlights, of course, of this occupation is the St. John's Co-Cathedral. This was built in honor of the defense of Malta and of Valletta. And after this time, Valletta was given the title of La Vittoria in Italian, right? The victory, the city of victory, it was called. Now, this is a rather austere facade, right? And for, an incredibly elaborate Baroque church on the inside. Fans of art history may know that Caravaggio, with all of the problems he was encountering painting for courts in Italy and for the papacy, eventually made his way down to Malta and became, accepted into the Order of the Knights of St. John. And when I was thinking about this this past week, it dawned on me, some of you may know people who are, members of the Knights of St. John or the Knights of St. Malta, which is now, morphed into a Catholic benevolent organization, and still has its basis inside inside Malta, in one of the fortification buildings. Yeah, and it's an incredible church, and it's one of those places that, until you go inside of it, right, you're, sort of overwhelmed, don't quite get the glory of it, for that matter, and the overwhelming Baroqueness of it all. Okay, there we go. Here is Valletta. There you can see the cupola of the cathedral. You can, and that tip of the island, right, where the original fortifications were. You can see the built-up fortifications along the entire, the entire peninsula where the city gets. And at the edge of this, right, you can see these massive fortification walls. In some places, they're 20, 30 feet wide at their base. So, they really made sure that this was never going to happen again. Unfortunately, as I said, by the time the French came through, the French got it without, much of a fight from the Knights, who had lost a lot of their power and influence in the changing world of that time. And then when the British come through, the French really have no stomach to be even defending it. And so it's part of the British Empire until the 1960s. Then it becomes part of the Commonwealth, and then finally, they celebrate Freedom Day, right? It becomes its own independent country for a long time, really sitting in a weird place between North Africa and Europe, not just geographically, but also linguistically as well, and in terms of the history that had encompassed this island. And now that it's become part of the European Union, right? It's become a rather good place to go go spending one's summers, or even better, one's winters. Now we have a lovely sunny day outside, but I know it's rather brisk and fall weather. But fall weather in Malta again is rather mild, and so sorry I have to do this, but for professional reasons that make me do these things. So again, if anyone is interested, I will be giving a tour for the Virgilian Society next December. It was supposed to be this December, but needless to say, COVID has pushed off all of our plans for that. So if you're interested, get in touch with me, or there you have the website that all of the information can be found on. So I have talked as long as I need to talk here, and so I can stop sharing now if that's okay, and we can get on with any questions you might have for me.